Hey bead friends, it's Lauren Harpster from Bead and Blossom. We are currently working through my Learn French Beading Intermediate Techniques series where we are learning how to build on top of and alter the techniques that I taught in my beginner course in order to make different kinds of shapes. Throughout this series, I am going to be assuming that you are already familiar with the techniques that I taught in my beginner course, so if you are not, I will have a link to my beginner course playlist in the description below. I will also have a link in the description where you can download a free PDF packet for my intermediate techniques. Now in this lesson, we're doing part 2 of my bent basic frame lesson. And in the previous video, I taught the basics of bent basic frame, and in this one, I'm going to teach you guys how to make these cup-shaped petals, which involve bending just one frame wire instead of both. It is a little bit trickier because one half of your petal has to remain flat, and then the other side ends up being three-dimensional. Now, I almost didn't include this variation of bent basic in my intermediate series. I kind of decided to go ahead and try it, throw it in last minute to see how everybody does with this. I might move it to my advanced course if it ends up being a little bit too much. Alright, let's go take a look. The sample pattern that we'll be working with today is a 15-row bent basic frame with a 5-bead basic row. We will be wrapping with a pointed bottom and round top. After row 7, we will bend the top wire back 45 degrees before continuing wrapping the rest of the rows. Then we will reduce to 2 bottom wires and lace across the center. Alright, I've already got my petal worked through row 7, which is where we're going to start bending our frame wire back. Now the pattern says we're only going to be bending the top wire. So we're going to take that top wire, we're going to bend it back 45 degrees. Now make sure you locate the back of your petal. The back should be the one with all the wire wraps on it. The front should be just beads. We're going to bend it back just 45 degrees. Alright, now with the 45-degree angle, we're not cupping. Our cupping is going to be a little less severe than if we were using a 90-degree angle bend. And I'll show the 90-degree angle bend here in just a little bit. But with a 45-degree angle bend, we want the same. It's the same idea as the 45-degree angle bend with the domes and the boats that I showed in my last video, in that we kind of want the rows to build outward a little bit and still cup at the top. With a 90-degree angle bend, we want them to be a little bit more below each other. So the 45-degree angle, what I'm going to suggest you guys do to measure out this first row that is cupped is to actually just measure out the row as you normally would to that top wire, and then reduce by a bead or 2. Now, whether you need 1 or 2 beads really depends on the beads that you're using, so I would kind of play around with both to see what works for you with the exact beads that you're using. I'm just going to go, maybe I'll do 2 on this one, and then we'll wrap at the top wire. Alright. Now the tricky part of just bending one frame wire back is that the rows at the bottom wire need to be straight and flat still. We just want the cupping to happen at the top. So I want my row to come in kind of off to the side but below that previous row of beads at the top. And then as we get towards the bottom, we want it to flatten out again. So sometimes what I do is kind of pinch my petal, mold the top first. So that's done. And then kind of pinch the petal and then wrap flat at the bottom. Alright, so I've got those 2 rows that are kind of coming inward a little bit there, right at the top, but then they flatten out at the bottom. Alright, we're going to do that again. So I'm going to make sure that my rows stay nice and flat at the bottom, so you can kind of pinch down there and then measure up to the top. Now you can measure the row normally and then reduce by a bead with this 45-degree angle bend. Now one thing that you can do is sometimes you can kind of clamp your little fingers down there at the bottom. I have an easier time if it's the bottom wire that I'm bending back to do that clamp, because then I clamp at the top. But anyways, with this top wire bend, I usually just kind of pinch down here while I'm molding my rows. Make sure the bottom is flat and then the top comes in. Alright, and then I'm going to hold that row in place and then wrap. Alright, so I'm going to measure out. Let's say I measure out my row normally here, like I showed you before. You can just measure out a normal row as if it were right beside. And then you kind of reduce by a bead or 2 in order to pull it in to make sure that your rows are kind of sloping at about the same rate from the top. Alright, we want, with the 45-degree angle bend, we want it to slope a little bit and not be directly underneath. So check from the top, make sure that your rows are lining up and making a nice little slopey slant there. And then pinch and flatten out at the bottom. All right, and I mentioned with the domes and boats that you can kind of put your finger on the inside of the dome or the bent part in order to feel whether those rows are lining up. So you can check them visually, but you can also check them by feeling them as well. A bead count is not going to work with this shape here. So put your finger on the inside and on the outside, and you can kind of feel whether those beads are lining up. You would be able to feel it if it's pulled in too tight. You'd be able to see it if it's pulled in too tight if you check on the side. All right, then wrap your row. And you will just continue doing that until you have all of your rows completed. So again, I'm going to check from the top, make sure I've got a nice slope there, and adjust my beads to make sure I got a slope, and then pinch at the bottom to make sure it flattens out. Now, just like with the domes and boats, you want to check that top wire every once in a while to make sure that it's still bending at approximately a 45-degree angle. It's not going to be a major deal if it bends a little bit, but just keep it somewhere in that range. I lost count. What am I doing here? 2, 3, 5, 6. Okay, this is my last 2 rows. So again, I'm going to... All right, so I'm going to do this wrong so I can show you what it looks like when it looks wrong. All right, so from the top, I can tell that it's wrong. As it's sticking out further than the other rows, it's not underneath. From the side, I can tell it's wrong because it doesn't follow the same sloping as the other rows. So I'm going to pull in by a bead, see if that fixes it, check it again, and that looks a lot closer. So I'm going to go with that. Pinch at the bottom if you can. And then continue on. So I'm kind of using my hands as a bit of a mold, and I know not everybody can do that with your hands. My hands are still young. They're fairly strong. They're small, but they're strong, and they're flexible. I know that not everybody can do that. So if you can't use your fingers as a mold, you might need to find your own way that works for your hands. Don't get frustrated if you can't do it the exact same way that I am. All right, so there is row 15, and we're going to cut off of the spool because we're reducing to 2 bottom wires. All right, so here's what the finished petal would look like. I'm not going to demonstrate the lacing in this because that's just regular lacing from my beginner course, but you would lace right across the center of the petal with the lacing wire showing on the inside and not showing on the outside. So what we end up here with is a petal with a little bit of a cupping right at the top, a little bit of a 3-dimensional aspect to our flower petal, but it's flat at the bottom. All right, so we've only got cupping on one end. All right, so let me quickly talk about the difference here between a 45-degree angle bend and a 90-degree angle bend on these cupped petals with bent basic frame. It's a little bit different than the domes, but it's fairly the same principles. So let me go over these little dome shapes again real quick. With a 45-degree angle bend with these little domes, you are wanting slanted sides. Your rows will be, when you're measuring your rows, they're going to stack underneath, but a little bit off to the side, not directly underneath. That way your rows kind of grow outward, and you get this nice little slope to the sides of your dome. Now with a 90-degree angle bend, your rows are going to be stacked right underneath each other. You'll bend your frame wires back at that 90-degree angles, and you're going to stack as close to directly underneath as possible, not off to the side like we do at the 45-degree angle bend. Your rows on a dome shape are going to be roughly the same length on a 90-degree angle bend, whereas your rows with a 45-degree angle bend on a dome shape are going to gradually increase. Now, let's talk about how that applies to these cut petals. Now, as I just showed you with the 45-degree angle bend on these cut petals, your rows are going to be underneath but directly off to the side, just like we did with the domes. So as you're stacking your petals, you still want them to grow a little bit, and we're going to have a little bit of a slope to the edge that we're cupping. It's not going to be completely flat up here. There's going to be a slope. All right, now let's talk about the 90-degree angle bend here. Now, just like the 90-degree angle bend on the dome, we want our sides to be nice and straight and flat. And we want our rows to kind of stack underneath each other in order to get that flat side. Whereas with the 45-degree angle, they're growing outward. And this one, they're not growing outward, they're staying about the same length so that they can stack underneath, and that gives you a straighter side. Now with the cup shapes, that's a little bit harder to do, and I'm going to talk about why here. Now, with this one, I bent the bottom wire back 90 degrees. When I measured out that first row, I'm going to measure it out normally, and then I'm going to reduce by probably 2 beads in order to get the dome shape at the bottom, in order to get a more severe dome shape than with the 45-degree angle bend. All right, now the reason why it's a little bit different from the domes here is because we have to switch from directly underneath to directly beside, and we have to make that transition smoothly. You can't just suddenly switch, at least not easily, from directly underneath to directly beside. There's a point in your petal. You'll start right at the wire that you're bending backwards. In this case, it's the bottom wire. You'll start by stacking your row directly underneath the previous row. Then as you get to the middle of the row, you're going to have to switch to being slightly off to the side of the previous row. Still underneath, but slightly off to the side, like the 45-degree angle bend. And then you can smoothly transition to being directly beside at that top, so you get a flat top. But it does produce a more severe cupping shape, because these at the bottom it's pulled in a little bit tighter, and you get kind of a shape that looks like this, where it's really tight and a little bit flatter at the bottom, a little sloped on the sides, and then flat at the top. Alrighty guys, that's it for Bent Basic Frame, and this is also the conclusion of my Intermediate Technique series. I hope you guys have enjoyed learning more about the art of French beaded flowers. Until next time, happy beading!